Hello, friends, and welcome to UA Legends, the podcast where each episode shines a spotlight on a hidden gem of the user acquisition world. I'll be your host, Adam, and together with my guests, we're going to deep dive into the wonderful world of user acquisition. We're going to tackle pressing industry topics and discuss the secrets behind my guests' successes. Please don't forget to follow us on AppsFlyer's YouTube channel, Spotify, Apple, or Amazon podcast channels. Okay, that's enough from me. Let's get on with it. It really is the Adam Show today, isn't it? Okay. Do you want to start by introducing yourself?
Yes. So I'm obviously other Adam, right? Especially in this case, right? This is Adam squared today. But my name is Adam Miller. I spent the last 16 to 17 years in growth marketing, user acquisition, lead generation, branding, all the things. And I've had this incredible ride over the last, 17 plus years in that digital marketing sphere, working on everything from healthcare to travel, and more recently focused on marketplaces. So I've spent the last 10 years focused on a handful of marketplaces, both on the asset side and the labor side. I've gone super deep there, and I've just been really honing that particular skill, because building marketplaces is such a unique thing.
And something that I've been asking lots of different people really is how you got into user acquisition in the first place, because it's not really one of those sort of childhood job roles that you think, I'm going to do that when I'm older.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember being about 21, 22 years old, and I got really, really deep into digital marketing. I think right around the time the music industry, which I was working in at that time, was doing some really cool things to promote different albums, promote different tours, really leveraging the internet in a way that we hadn't seen for marketing these different products. And whenever I graduated, I knew I wanted to go into digital marketing. I was living in Philadelphia at the time, and I had a shot to go and work at my dream job, which is at this agency called Razorfish. They were one of the original companies that really leaned into digital marketing, especially at a time when a lot of other agencies were still doing TV. They were still doing print. They were truly ahead of the curve. And I had this incredible opportunity to go into these brand managers, these very big healthcare companies, and say, I know you love your print ads, I know you love your TV ads, but trust me, this internet thing, it's going to be big. So maybe you should give me more than 1% of your budget.
Different.
It's different. So because it's different, it's also a little bit scary. Anybody who's ever worked in healthcare and understands compliance issues will totally understand that. But it was just this really interesting watershed moment when you start doing all this digital marketing at a time when everybody is still really hesitant to jump in, especially with both feet. And then eventually, yes, I moved to San Francisco, was able to start working in technology companies. And that's when things I would say really shifted from doing more lead gen, brand marketing, using digital channels, and really doing full on user acquisition.
So you've been through a lot of different industries, like doing the user acquisition and doing the marketing side of stuff, but through a lot of different industries. What have you noticed from that, if anything? Do you have some kind of a takeaway from just seeing all of those different industries and how they operate, and anything to take away from that?
Oh, totally. I mean, if you don't like working with lawyers, don't go into healthcare. Almost anything you do in healthcare is going to have to go through some sort of legal review. 10 different teams will be involved. And as a result, the industry just moves at a slightly slower pace, but especially making health claims. But realistically, outside of that, I mean, there are a couple of commonalities. I would say, being able to speak in the voice of the consumer and being able to recognize what's really important to your end customer never goes out of fashion, right? That's something that you're going to need to do, whether you're doing lead gen, whether you're doing branding, whether you're doing user acquisition. You are always going to have to be able to get inside the head of your consumer and really understand your target market. You have to understand what's important to them in order to be able to communicate with them very effectively. But that, I would say, is the commonality regardless of what vertical you're in. But yeah, I really glommed on to travel more recently and some of these more mobility oriented marketplaces, logistics marketplaces, because there is so much freedom to really expand the use case for that particular product set.
Well, Adam, I'm glad you brought up marketplaces, because that's what we're actually going to be talking about today. So when we say marketplace, what do we actually mean?
Yeah, so put very simply, I mean, marketplaces are typically whenever you connect consumers and producers. And I say consumers and producers because I think we've talked very myopically about buyers and sellers for far too long. I think we've moved beyond that point at which we're just simply taking somebody who wants a product and somebody who's selling a product like traditional e-commerce, right? Now
Yeah.
we're renting and trading and borrowing all kinds of goods and services. And that's why I think we really evolved this concept of marketplaces over time. It may have started with things like eBay, right, all the way back in the 90s, but we've since evolved, and now you're seeing these really incredible use cases from companies like Uber and Airbnb, and even those companies are actually part of an era that is now 15 years old, right? So
Yeah, yeah,
now
for
we're in
sure.
this.
I mean,
Now we're in
eBay
this
is obviously the big one when I think of marketplaces.
the
I
godfather
hadn't
of
really considered
marketplaces.
Uber as being a marketplace.
Absolutely. I mean, Uber is like the canonical example more recently, as is Airbnb. But the reality is, we're now seeing all these other really interesting marketplaces crop up in parts of the economy when we didn't really, when in parts of the economy we didn't really think that marketplaces really could insert themselves in a really big way and ultimately change the economics of those particular markets. Just throw out a couple of names. I think of companies like Wonder School, right, doing incredible things in childcare. I think of companies like Fair, Faire, one of the biggest companies I don't think anyone has ever heard of, and that's because they're largely wholesale to retail type relationships.
Right.
There are whole marketplaces to be conceived of that we just haven't really thought of at this point.
And so when it comes to the sort of marketing challenges surrounding that, what are some of the biggest challenges? How is I've been talking to people about how sort of ecom differs from gaming. I mean, I've got a gaming background, but gaming, if it differs from ecom, is that are there the same kind of differences for marketplaces, or is that still aligned with, or is that more aligned with ecom than anything else?
Oh, more aligned with e-com than anything else. I think marketplaces, what makes them so unique is, again, they're asset light. They usually have some sort of power law if we're talking about asset marketplaces, or we're talking about marketplaces with services. You also have these incredible network effects that also take place. Now, if I had to think about like what are some of the commonalities between e-com marketplaces and gaming, Roblox. I think Roblox is a great example of a marketplace, right? The core of their
Very true.
business is selling these virtual goods, right?
Mm.
And that is really at the heart of all of this, right? Is can you be this layer of software that connects consumers and producers? I would even go so far as to say that at a certain point in time, Netflix was a marketplace. I don't think they started as a marketplace. I don't think they're a marketplace today. But in this sort of messy middle in their evolution, I think at one point they were a marketplace when they were a pure play streaming platform that was doing nothing more than connecting people at home with, a Wi-Fi connection and maybe a Roku box with a lot of content from other studios. It wasn't their
Mm.
content, right? Now that they're in the original production game, I would say they're far less of a marketplace today. But even companies like that, I would say, have gone through this sort of marketplace journey.
So when obviously with and again I come from a gaming background, so everything is going to be focused surrounding gaming for me,
Do
but
it. Let's
in,
talk
in
gaming.
terms of in terms of gaming, generally speaking, the US is the primary market for a lot of for pretty much anything that you're doing, or now China's sort of more getting on the same kind of scale. How does that scale across to marketplaces? Is that the same kind of dominance on one geolocation, or are you spread across multiple different countries and have to run user acquisition campaigns in all of those different countries to the same level as you would in the US for a gaming team?
Yeah, I'm going to give you the most frustrating answer of all. It depends. So there's some marketplaces that I think are inherently hyper local,
I
right?
set myself up for that.
Sorry, it's early here. I know it's probably late there. I mean, it's fine. We're on different wavelengths, and that's what's going to make this so fun.
We were just saying
Uh,
it's been a very long week as well.
this is why I've got this. Anybody who knows me knows that like when I'm working in an office setting, like the cup of coffee never leaves my hand. That's just a given. Every meeting, every visit, every even just walking around, cup of coffee never leaves my hand. Anyway, marketplaces, how exactly do they scale? So I think again, frustrating answer is it depends, right? Sometimes
Mm,
there are hyper local network effects that then level up to even broader network effects. Canonical example here is probably something like Uber, right? So you're not going to order an Uber in Los Angeles from New York, right? It's
yeah.
just not going to happen. However, there are these larger network effects that can be layered on. They're sort of like network effects of network effects, if you will. Not to get too meta about it, but when you're on the ground and you live in a given city, you can leverage the service in so many different ways. But then when you travel, because the supply side is also available in that country, because the network exists there, you can tap into that local network, right? So sometimes you do get these really interesting international network effects. Now, from a gaming standpoint, here's where it probably differs, right? When you acquire a customer in, I don't know, Brazil, let's say, they're going to be largely playing the game in Brazil. But when you're especially working with travel marketplaces, one of the predications and one of the strengths that you sort of lean into is that you very well are going to be acquiring users in different countries who are then going to come to another country and use the service, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And such is the nature of travel, right? I might acquire somebody in the UK with the predication that they are going to come to the US and use X, Y, and Z service.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And in terms of the sort of standard user acquisition approach, is it, does it fall under the same sort of networks? You have the SRNs, which are the sort of dominant force within user acquisition, and then all of the sort of long tail networks for fine tuning and trying to scale across multiple, more networks.
Yeah, the reach is definitely with those SRNs, right? I mean, nobody can really beat them. I think that's why they are as dominant as they are. They're just at a scale that no one can really conceive of, especially when 2 or 3 networks combined can reach, let's call it 4 out of 5 people on planet Earth. I mean, it's really impressive just how much they've continued to grow and even just the last 2 to 3 years. So there's no beating them. And yes, you're absolutely right that that's where you turn first, right? But after that, I think it does get a little bit more specialized. I think gaming is sort of its own beast in that regard. I think if you're going to go into user acquisition, it's going to, after those couple of SRNs are effectively covered off on, it really does depend on what kind of marketplace we're talking about, what kind of app we're talking about. You're going to have to go a little bit more specialized. In the travel spaces, for instance, we tended to rely more on online travel agencies as opposed to lifestyle brands who are probably going to want to go a little bit broader. Or maybe if it's a labor marketplace, maybe you're also advertising on job boards and places where people are actively searching for jobs. So after the big, let's call it the big players are covered off, then you really want to start thinking about how to specialize your strategy.
Interesting. And so you're an expert in the marketplace space. Is there a sort of something to be aware of that differs massively from any other industry?
Yeah, I think marketplaces are unique for a couple of reasons, but the biggest one I think most people point out is the cold start problem, right? So when you're starting a marketplace, you have to make some decisions around how to build up 2 sides of this thing, right? It's not like you create this product and it's just readily available for distribution. The participants in the market are effectively what make the product. So you have to think about how exactly to onboard supply. Usually in the very earliest days, it's through some sort of concierge process. I mean, you are really hand-holding a lot of supply participants. When I say supply, the canonical example would be Airbnb hosts, right? You have to explain to them what hosting is, what's expected of them, when they're going to get a booking, right? You have to think through all these different mechanics so that way you're setting their expectations because they really are the lifeblood of any marketplace. And that leads into what I typically call first liquidity, right? So this is when you first start getting your supply, you get your demand, and you finally start matching them, and you finally see some actual transaction volume happening, right? The second thing I'll point out that is tends to be a little bit different with marketplaces is supply management, right? You have to be very, very close to the supply side of that business and really coaching hosts at all times, right? In the case of Uber, we're talking drivers. In the case of Postmates, we're talking couriers. But you are always talking about the supply side of the marketplace because you want to make sure that you're keeping them engaged, right? Engagement is a huge part of the marketplace. You can imagine somebody on Airbnb who might list a home and then forget that they listed a home, right? And then all of a sudden, 3 months later, somebody says, "Hey, I'd like to stay at your place." I'm like, I forgot I was even on this thing, right? So you have to make sure that all sides are being engaged and being coached properly. And then the third thing is really trust and safety, especially if you have a marketplace that lives in the IRL economy, right? Whether it's a travel company, whether it's a food delivery company, it could be a number of different things. But if it interacts in the physical world, you have to make sure that trust and safety is a really core competency of the company. And trust and safety, even supply management, even liquidity, these are all things I think are at a really exciting time because they only get better with some of the advances we're seeing in generative artificial intelligence, right? I realize everything is AI, but like there are some very practical applications of that technology inside of marketplaces that will make the flywheel spin a lot faster, accelerate growth, but also catch any bad actors.
Yeah, I mean, kind of fraudulent activity must be one that AI is going to be a godsend for. Sort of being able to establish anomalies in terms of usage and that kind of thing, I think will be huge.
Absolutely. I think LLMs are good at one thing, especially, right? And that is consumption and distillation of data, right? We're talking about really inference that they're then going to base on a lot of the learning that they've already done. And that is really incredible when you can feed not only larger amounts of data into them from just the overall web, but then also feed bespoke amounts of data into them that they can then learn from, right? Because then you're talking about an LLM that is really tuned to your business.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So who's done it right? Have you got any examples of like the sort of holy grail of marketing campaigns for marketplaces? Who's
Uh,
really excelled?
so this is a little bit of bias on my part, but I'll go back to two companies that I think have a lot in common, right? Airbnb, and then a company I spent a long time at, which is Turo. The reason why I think that they've really nailed this really interesting model is because one, they are asset light, but you also have this incredible dynamic between hosts and guests. And that dynamic is so powerful in that you create this almost bi-directional participation in the marketplace where hosts become guests and guests become hosts. And it's a really unique marketplace when you can get people participating on both sides with some regularity. And you do
Yeah.
see that tend to happen in those kinds of marketplaces. But I would say that is really a secret sauce that I think is very difficult to replicate in most others.
And has the go to market for? I mean, obviously Airbnb has been around for a while now, but the original go to market for that, did they do it in any different way to anything that's been done before, or did they approach it in any kind of different way?
Yeah, if we're talking Airbnb specifically, I think they very famously went after the brand side, right? They built this brand that was around trust and safety. They built this brand around making sure that you are, don't just go there, belong there, right? I think that is a really powerful message, and hats off to them for leaning into that as early as they did in their life cycle, right? But I think that was something I think was very underrated for a very long period of time. And I think only now are they really starting to reap the benefits of really investing in their brand and really, really having something that has some sort of emotional attachment to it.
I mean, brand takes a long time, though, doesn't it? You have to be there. You have to be in the public eye for for a long time to become established.
Well, I think in order for your brand to really shine, your product just has to live up to the promise that it makes, right? So if you promise certain things in your brand, don't go there, live there, belong there, that kind of thing, people really should feel that way whenever they go and visit another country, right? Or when they stay in a place that they never expected to stay. They should really feel like I have temporarily at least assimilated into this culture in a way that and have gotten an experience that I otherwise could not have gotten would I have stayed at a hotel. And
Yeah,
quite honestly, I tend to think about this a lot, even in the context of marketplace mechanics, because you do think about how these pieces of software effectively connect people. And when they do their job well, they connect people in ways in which we don't quite imagine today. And the example I would give is, or at least the way that I tend to think about it is take the counterfactuals, for instance, right? In the absence of that marketplace, would these consumers and producers even be interacting with each other? And if the answer is no, then you probably have a really interesting marketplace.
I love that. I love that. Um, okay, so what are some of the obstacles when it comes to marketplaces and more specifically the marketing of marketplaces?
Yeah, I would say historically they've been pretty capital intensive. If we look back over the last 15 years and we think about how those marketplaces were built, they were built on the back of a lot of capital, and that capital was very cheap for the last 15 years, right? We're talking ZIRP era, right? Zero interest rate policy. And you think about all the capital that went into just getting them to that scale. A lot of that capital was invested on two sides of the business, right? Not just on growing demand, not just on growing supply, but growing supply and demand simultaneously.
Yeah.
And when I think about the next 15 years, we're just not going to build marketplaces in that way. Capital is just more expensive now than it was in the past. And I think that there are probably ways for us to go and build these things in a little bit more of not a slower growth environment, but an environment in which we are much more conscious of our margins than we were in the past, right? Because we have, I would say, decidedly come out of this era in which growth was the number one overriding factor, hard stop, right? Now we're in this place where we're saying, what is our margin? How do we maintain margins while growing? And what is the maximum growth potential of this company if we want to maintain positive margins over some period of time? So I just think that whole equation is being rethought, and as a result, we're just not going to build them the same way that we did in the last era.
And is there still room for like sort of global marketplaces, or has the world become fairly saturated with marketplaces? So now the marketplaces need to become more niche in their very nature to fulfill certain subsets of the audience.
I wouldn't say niche. I would say they're going to have to find differentiation in different parts of these economies, right? So I think, again, the great example I love to give is FAIR, FAIRE, and apologize if I keep respelling that, because whenever I say, hey, have you heard of FAIR.com? A lot of people go, no, or they try to look up FAIR, and like, no,
never
not that
find
one.
it.
Not that one. So, and the reason why I always go back to this example is because they I think correctly surveyed the market and said there's all this competition at the consumer and retail level for customer relationships. That is a game that we're not sure we can win. But if we move along the vertical supply chain and we go to the wholesale to retail relationship, there's nothing happening there, right? And it should be as easy to order from a wholesaler as it is for a customer to order from a retailer. So why don't we insert a marketplace there? And that company now, and again, I don't want to misspeak there, but I'm pretty sure they're valued around $13 billion, right? I believe that was the last reported valuation. So again, talk about one of the biggest companies that no one's ever heard of. But I think that marketplaces on a go-forward basis are going to look a little bit more like that. I think you're going to go and try to solve very core problems, and they're not necessarily going to be obvious consumer problems. I think what you're going to see is a lot more companies that are creating wedges. They go and insert a wedge into an industry and then eventually build a marketplace on top of that. And I think that becomes even more likely now that we have all this generative AI power, where we can create all these really interesting, whether you call them agents, whether you call them bots. You can go and create an agent, insert it into an ecosystem, and then ultimately build a marketplace on top of that agent.
It starts to become very, very, very interesting at that point. This conversation could go on for a very long time. Conscious of time, though, I think we shall call the marketplace conversation. But I would like to ask you a couple of other questions. We have a lot of people listening to this podcast who are perhaps newer to the user acquisition world and maybe even marketing as a whole. So I'd love to know what you know now that you wish you'd known when you started in your career.
Oh boy, overall or just with respect to marketing?
Anything. It can be absolutely anything. We've had some corking answers up until this point, so feel free to.
Yeah, I guess I'll throw out a couple of things. One, always be curious. I don't think you're going to get anywhere unless you're naturally curious. I always say this, but I love to work with people who create their own work. When you work with somebody who just identifies problems and then goes to work understanding that problem, taking it apart, trying to understand all the nuances, what is a symptom, what is a root cause, and really thinks about things from a first principles perspective, that is like foundational. And I think that is something that you notice some people just naturally think that way. Some people have to learn to think that way. But that is something that I would love to go back and tell my 22-year-old self, like always be thinking from first principles. The second thing I would think about is just prioritization. That is like the end all be all. Like not everything you do actually produces a good result. And you really have to look at all the things that you're doing at any given time and saying what's working here, what's not, and is the magnitude of outcome, if you have to spend 5 minutes on one task or 5 minutes on another task, are they the same? The answer is almost always no. There are going to be some things that just produce outsized outcomes, and you should go and spend every minute you can on those things, because at the end of the day, you're just playing small ball if you're just focused on things that just aren't going to produce big outcomes. Um, and then the third thing I would say is, continue to build personal relationships. I think that is so important. And the reason why I would say that as a third is because, and that's not in any particular order, but I think personal relationships are so important, especially post COVID. You do meet a lot of young professionals or people going into the workforce for the first time. It's a very strange world that they're going into, 100% remote sometimes, at best hybrid. I would encourage those people just to get into the office, right? There's no better way to build personal relationships. That's just too important.
I honestly wonder how some people are being able to sort of learn from, the amount of time I spent learning from my seniors when I was when I was back in the office before COVID. It's incredible, and you sort of think going into a workplace and not having that sort of 8 hour a day connection with the people that you're working with to actually understand why they're looking into certain things and how it's operating and everything else. I do think that's at a detriment.
Yeah, and I would classify this as osmosis. That's how I love to think about it. You learn just by being around people in close
Yeah.
proximity. Their best traits will rub off on you. You will learn so much just by being there and doing it in the same environment. But I completely agree. I consider myself
Why
very
do you
lucky
think I
to
do these podcasts all the time?
have love it. I consider myself lucky to have come up during, in a pre-COVID era and been able to do that. And quite frankly, even pre-COVID, I was one of those people who thought, get into the office early, get started early, sure, stay late, just, put in the hours and just be present in the office. And again, it pays dividends in ways that you can't conceive of. Fast forward during COVID, I, like a lot of other people, were like, wow, this is super convenient. I get to wake up, I literally walk to my computer, and boom, I'm at work. But it does have its limitations. It really does. And ask anybody who's been working remote for a year, 2 years, they'll tell you, like, being back in the office is much, much needed.
I completely agree. I think they're all fantastic points, actually. And the last question that I've got for you today is: what are some good sources of knowledge? How have you learned up, especially in the user acquisition field? How have you learned how to do stuff? Like it's not a university course. It's not something you can just go and somewhere to learn. So how have you picked up this information?
You got to start doing it. That's really the best way. You just got to start doing it. To your point, you're not going to go to a university class and suddenly learn user acquisition, which again, a lot of user acquisition abides by uh, economic principles. If somebody's really interested in getting into growth or user acquisition, I always recommend that they go and take an economics course, especially if you're interested in user acquisition, because there are going to be a lot of situations you're going to be in that are going to bend to the whims of supply and demand. That's just what you're going to be working in every single day, and you're going to have to figure out how to make those supply and demand equations work for you. The other thing I would say is, if you're interested in getting into this world, go find a company that just needs somebody at the junior level and just start working for them, or even offer to intern for them. I think co-ops, as a for instance, have been tragically underrated. I went to a school, Drexel University, that offers a fantastic co-op program, and I know it's paid dividends for a number of students that have come out of there who say, I never would have been able to get into this field had I not co-opted.
Yeah,
I had a
because you
slightly
don't have
different.
experience, so you can't be good at
Exactly.
it. But you can't get
Exactly.
experience.
And just to bring this full circle, I only got my first gig. I shouldn't say I only got it for this reason, but I think it was definitely an overriding factor. I got my first gig at Razorfish because I had actually taken a course where they asked me to do a little bit of digital marketing. And so walking into that interview, I knew what a CPM was and how to calculate click-through rates and things like that. When most of the other candidates were like, "What is a CPM?" I had already
Yeah.
been doing that for a previous course. And that definitely gave me a leg up. And they told me as much after they hired me. So go and learn as much of this as you can. But the best way to learn is just by doing.
Amazing. Well, Adam Miller, you are a UA legend. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute honor.
Yeah, thank you so much, Adam. One Adam to another. I greatly appreciate the time. It's been amazing talking to you. And please, if you're ever on this side of the pond, look me up.
Definitely. Thank you very much.